at exactly 9:03 a.m. On a humid Tuesday morning, the double doors of the Monroe County Courthouse creaked open with reluctant groans like they too disapproved of the case about to be heard. The air inside the courtroom was thick not just with the weight of the August heat, but with judgment that lingered in every glance and whispered word. Rows of polished oak benches stretched beneath a vaulted ceiling that made every cough, every rustle of paper echo like thunder. And into that thunder walked Jelliah Brooks. She was just 16. Her sneakers squeaked softly on the linoleum, her shoulders squared with effort more than confidence. No lawyer flanked her, no parent stood at her side. Just a slim black girl with neatly braided hair, clean school shoes, and a steel resolve hidden somewhere behind the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Every head turned. Some eyes narrowed. Others whispered, "That's the one. The graffiti girl. She's the one who painted the wall." No remorse. The murmurs followed her to the defendant's table like shadows. Presiding over the case was Judge Milton Hanover, a man whose reputation in the county was synonymous with efficient and unyielding. His silver hair sat perfectly combed beneath the fluorescent lights, and his stare, cold and dissecting, dropped over his wire-rimmed glasses like a verdict. One glance at Jelliah, then back to his papers as if she'd already been sentenced in his mind. Jelliah folded her hands in her lap, pressing them together tightly enough to turn her knuckles pale. Her chin didn't tremble. Not exactly. But there was a stiffness in her posture, the kind people wear when they know they're not just being looked at, they're being measured. The prosecutor was already standing. Tall, tailored, confident in the way only a man who had never doubted his place in a courtroom could be. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "the facts of this case are simple." The defendant, he motioned lazily at Jelliah without sparing her a glance, willfully defaced public property. A full-scale mural on the southern wall of City Hall. Painted in broad daylight. Captured on multiple surveillance cameras. This is not a case of mistaken identity. He paced slowly. Each footstep hit the floor with intentional weight. The mural in question depicts violent imagery, and worse, a phrase that directly challenges and demeans our police force. This was not a random act of teenage mischief, it was a calculated political statement. He paused, then delivered his final point like a spear. "We're not here to argue motive. We're here to reinforce the idea that actions have consequences. That lawlessness is not activism." Judge Hanover removed his glasses, polishing them with a cloth that looked so white it could have been issued with a halo. "So," he said slowly, "she's a revolutionary now?" A smattering of uncomfortable chuckles bubbled up from the gallery. The judge barely smirked. "A child with a can of paint and an inflated sense of purpose," he continued. Then, finally, he looked Jelliah in the eye. "Miss Brooks, you're 16 years old. What exactly do you think you're fighting for?" Jelliah opened her mouth, then closed it again. Hanover didn't wait for an answer. "Children today mistake rebellion for meaning," he said, reclining into his chair. "And now they bring that confusion into my courtroom." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jelliah's eyes shimmered not with fear, but something sharper. Something old. Something burning. But the courtroom didn't see that. They saw a headline in waiting. A mistake. A juvenile delinquent who needed a lecture, not a fair hearing. What they didn't see not yet was the reason Jelliah had come here alone. Because sometimes history doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing school shoes and carrying nothing but a memory. "Your Honor," she said softly. "May I speak?" The courtroom turned toward her like a single body. Hanover didn't even look up from his notes. "No," he said. One word. But it hit harder than any sentence. Still, Jelliah tried again. "I'd like to explain." Hanover looked up now, his expression not annoyed, just cold. "Explain," he said. "This is not a classroom, Miss Brooks. This is a courtroom. You're not here to educate anyone. You're here because you broke the law. Sit down and be silent." And so she did. But silence was never surrender. Not for her. In that moment, Jelliah drifted not away from the courtroom, but deeper into herself. She was 10 again, curled into the couch on Pine Street. The one with the loose leg and the throw blanket that always smelled like lemon balm and fresh laundry. Her father, Terrence Brooks, sat beside her with a thick, weathered book in his lap. "These," he said, tapping the cover, "are the words they don't want you to know. Learn them anyway." She leaned in, small and curious. "What is it?" "A collection of court cases. Real people. Real voices. They knew the law, so the system had to look them in the eye." He had once been a beloved high school history teacher. That was until he dared to stray from the scripted curriculum. During Black History Month, he had spoken of redlining, police overreach, and the stories textbook skipped. They fired him for bias. But at home, he never stopped teaching. On her 12th birthday, he handed her that same thick book. Inside, he'd written, "For the day you'll need it. And you will." Jalaiah carried that book with her everywhere. Not physically, but in her bones. Especially now. During the court recess, they placed her in a holding room, 4 gray walls, 1 stiff chair, a water fountain that hissed more than it poured. She sat cross-legged on the floor, a worn folder open in front of her. Inside were photocopies, some blurry, some stained-off landmark legal cases. One in particular had been read so many times the paper was almost transparent. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. She whispered the key line aloud like a prayer: "Students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate." If that was true at school, it had to be true everywhere. Even here. Especially here. When the guard motioned her back into the courtroom, Jalaiah stood with purpose. Not defiance. Just quiet certainty. Back in the courtroom, everything looked the same. The wood. The walls. The wary glances. But something was different. Jalaiah felt it like a current. She took her seat but didn't shrink into it. She folded her hands again, but this time they didn't tremble. Judge Hanover cleared his throat. "We'll resume," he said. But as the prosecutor began to rise, Jalaiah stood first. The shift in the room was immediate. One heartbeat of stunned silence. Then Hanover's voice, sharper now, "Miss Brooks, you were not asked to speak." "I understand, Your Honor," she said calmly. "But if this court is going to decide my future, I believe I have the right to speak for myself." Hanover's eyes narrowed. For a second, he said nothing. Then finally, he gestured. 2 minutes. Jalaiah reached into her pocket and pulled out the worn page. "I'd like to refer this court," she began, "to Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District, 1969. Now the entire courtroom froze. Even the prosecutor stopped shuffling his papers. "In that ruling," she continued, her voice steady, "the Supreme Court determined that students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. If that right holds in school, it certainly must hold in a public space, especially when the speech is peaceful, truthful, and aimed at raising awareness." She unfolded the paper and held it up. "The mural I painted wasn't vandalism. It was protest. And protest," she paused, "is not a crime." The room was silent. Not a breath moved. Even the judge's fingers had stilled. For the first time, no one looked at her as a defiant kid. They saw a citizen. They saw a voice. At the very back of the room, a woman named Olivia Pierce sat with her notebook open and her pen frozen mid-sentence. She had once been a student in Terrence Brooks' classroom. She hadn't seen him in years. But now, watching Jalaiah speak with the same precision and passion, she knew this was his legacy. She closed her notebook, stepped outside beneath the old oak tree by the courthouse steps, and opened her laptop. The article she wrote went viral in hours. Teen invokes Supreme Court precedent in own defense stuns courtroom. She quoted Jalaiah word for word. She reminded readers who Terrence Brooks was. And most importantly, she reminded them why justice must sometimes be interrupted in order to be seen clearly. Judge Hanover read the article too. Alone in his chambers, he stared at the image of the mural Jalaiah had painted. A man's face, painted in stark lines, hands raised in surrender. Beneath it, "Do I look threatening to you?" He remembered a case. Then another. Then too many. Faces. Voices. Moments when he'd dismissed something because it came from someone he didn't expect to have power. He'd told himself it was neutrality. But maybe it had been something else. When court resumed, the silence was electric. Hanover entered slowly, seated himself, and looked directly at Jalaiah. "I've taken the past hour to reflect," he began, voice steady but softer than before. "Not on what's trending, not on the media, but on what I failed to hear in this courtroom. Miss Brooks, I dismissed your voice because I assumed it lacked weight. That was a mistake." A gasp rippled through the room. "This court rules in favor of the defendant. All charges are dismissed." He banged the gavel once. Then he added, "And it is the recommendation of this court that the mural in question remain. Not as graffiti, but as a reminder that justice sometimes needs to be challenged to be found." When Jalaiah stepped out into the sun, the world felt whiter. Her father was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Same old gray sweater. Same old book tucked under one arm. His eyes wet and proud. You did it, baby, he whispered. You made them listen. She didn't respond. She didn't need to, because sometimes truth doesn't shout. Sometimes it just waits for someone brave enough to say it out loud. And that day, in a courtroom built to silence her, Jelia Brooks made the truth impossible to ignore.